I guess it's officially afternoon, so good afternoon, everybody. It's really a great pleasure to welcome you to this CTSI Distinguished Lecture Series. And it's our great pleasure in the Precision Health and the School of Medicine to have this opportunity to invite one of our most distinguished colleagues, Marylyn Ritchie, who is the Vice Dean of Artificial Intelligence and Computing in the Perelman School of Medicine, the Director of the Institute for Biomedical Informatics, Director, Division of Informatics, Vice President of Research Informatics, etc. There's too many titles, but she is the Edward Rose and Elizabeth Kirk Rose Professor of Genetics. She's an expert in translational bioinformatics with a focus on developing and applying and disseminating algorithms, methods, and tools that integrate bioinformatics. She's authored over 400 publications, is a fellow of the American College of Medical Informatics. She's won many awards, which I don't have time to go through because I want to hear her talk, but she's an elected member of the National Academy of Medicine in 2021, and recognizing for her paradigm-changing work. The mission of her lab is to improve the understanding of the architecture of common complex diseases, and she's absolutely focused on the implementation of precision medicine into routine clinical care, a challenge that we're all facing. So she's won, just tons of awards. I feel bad not being able to say all of them, but I really want to thank her for coming. She has a super busy schedule, so putting us on the schedule has been awesome, and we're really looking forward to her talk today. Thanks a lot for coming.
All right, I don't see the okay. Can I click that? No, I can't click okay. Lucy, I can't click okay. Maybe that's this computer. There we go. Yep. Okay, now we're good. Good afternoon, everyone. David, thank you so much for that introduction. It was really nice, and no need to embarrass me with all the awards and things. That was perfect. So I'm really excited to be with you all today, and hello to those of you on Zoom. Hopefully you can hear and see everything okay. So as David said, I'm in a new Vice Dean role, and so he invited me to come give this talk probably last summer or last fall, and I debated for months. I looked on the website trying to figure out what people talked about, and I didn't see much about AI. And so since that's my job at Penn right now, and I've been so focused on it, that's what I decided to talk about today. Also, I just finished working on our CTSI renewal, and there was lots of AI stuff in it. And so I know for those of you working in the CTSI space, this is something that NCATS and a lot of our community is thinking a lot about. So to get us started, AI for precision health. So a big piece of my job right now is helping the Dean of the School of Medicine kind of predict the future. Where is the puck going? What should we be investing in terms of AI at Penn Medicine now to position us to be leaders, 3 years from now or 5 years from now? And as you can imagine, the way that the field has been moving, it's very hard to predict where things are headed because it's been happening very, very quickly. And I find myself thinking a lot about the past in trying to predict the future, which maybe is surprising. It certainly was surprising to myself as I started about a little over a year and a half ago in this journey. I hate history. That is my least favorite subject in school. And as I caught myself looking through scientific literature and scientific history and the history of AI, I was like, oh my gosh, I'm becoming a history nerd. I hate this about myself. But I have found it really, really helpful because there have been a couple of points in my, not so long career that we have had similar things happen, which I would refer to as disruptions. And that is what we're going through right now. So I will share two and then talk about the one that we're in right now. So first, the evolution of the internet. So I don't know how many of you recall doing science before the internet, but I do. Certainly those of us who trained in kind of the 90s, early training, we did not have the internet in a big way. We might have had email. But I remember being in graduate school and having professors say, you need to do this review paper and you may not use the internet. And so you had to go to the library and go to these things for the students in the audience. These are encyclopedias. They're these big books that have facts in them. You had to go to these. You also had to go to journals, and they looked like this. And many of your professors probably have these still in their offices. I know I do. I still have stacks of old journals when we used to get paper copies. And a big skill that I developed in graduate school was how to photocopy the maximum number of pages in the least amount of money because I was poor. And so you would sit there like, okay, if I turn the page like this, could I actually do 2 journals at the same time and just do them at 50%? And then I can cut them later and staple them back together. Like, this was seriously a skill that I developed in graduate school, which now is laughable and silly. But I think we're experiencing the same thing right now. I have faculty at Penn who are telling students, you may not use the internet to do this exercise or this assignment. And it feels a lot like what I experienced with the internet. The other one was in genetic genotyping and sequencing. So embarrassingly, my PhD was on 25 SNPs. I was studying sporadic breast cancer. I was developing statistical genetics methods for 25 SNPs. And my graduate students asked to see my thesis, and they look at it and they're like, is this a joke? I'm like, no, it's not a joke. That was a big data set back in 1999. Now we're dealing with, millions of genetic variants, as well as RNA sequence, methylation data, proteomic data. But that genetic data disruption totally changed the field of human genetics. We had to totally think differently about our study design, about the computational methods and statistical methods that we used, and everything changed. And so now if someone said, I want to do a study the old-fashioned way, you would never do it. And ChatGPT is changing that, not just for computer science and engineering, not just for math, not for medicine. It's happening across the board in every industry. So I think this is more similar to what happened with the internet. But I think what's different here is the pace is so much faster. The internet came out, but it kind of, at least at the time, felt like, one technology after another. Every couple years, there would be something else. But what's happening in AI is much, much faster. So a little bit of level setting, especially because I know there have not been a lot of talks on AI in this forum. When I say AI, I'm thinking of like the big circle AI. I mean, all of the field. That is not always what people are excited about. So AI as a big field has subfields within it. So machine learning is something that a lot of people in kind of precision medicine, precision health have been doing for a long time. People often ask me, we have a process now, if you're going to do AI, the IRB requires a second level of AI governance review. And so the machine learning experts are like, you want me to submit a review every time I run a logistic regression because that's machine learning. I'm like, no, that's not the intent. The intent is you're going to do generative AI and use some commercial tool. But if you're not careful in your definitions, logistic regression is a type of AI. And then there's deep learning, which is, these deep neural networks and generative adversarial neural networks. And then there's generative AI. So this little tiny bubble of AI is what has everyone excited. So I've been working in AI since my PhD thesis. I used genetic programming, which is a type of evolutionary computation to evolve the structure of a neural network. That was my PhD thesis project. No one in my family or friend group could have cared less about what I did until just last year. And they're all like, you work in AI? That's so cool. Like, yeah, it's been cool for a really long time. AI has actually been around since the 1950s, which is even before my time, but now everybody is excited about it and everybody does it. For those who don't know a lot about AI, but want to learn, this is a great review paper. If you want to take a screenshot or a photo, this NPJ Digital Medicine really carefully talks through the differences between supervised and unsupervised machine learning, what the difference is between deep learning and regular machine learning, where generative AI kind of falls into that, about reinforcement learning. Really good topical review that teaches you kind of the terms and how these methods are similar to one another and different from one another, and kind of all of that kind of compare contrast. So why is this so important now? It's really this kind of foundation model and large language models that have transformed everything. So GPT is the one that most people know about. This originally came out in 2018. Most of you in the audience probably didn't hear about it until 2022. That's also when I learned about it. That's when ChatGPT came out. That was the chatbot interface to work with the large language model. That totally changed everything. So OpenAI has theirs, Meta has one, Google has one, everybody has one now. And it's really changing the way that we do everything that we do. Why is that happening? It's because this technology is allowing us to build foundation models. And what's unique about a foundation model is the ability to combine lots of different multimodal data in its raw form. So previously, I've done multiomics analysis for 15 years. Most of what we had to do, and it also worked with EHR data, electronic health record data, which I will talk about. But most of what we had to do before, even with AI and machine learning, was take these different data types and convert them or map them so that the representation looked the same. So you were working with, a set of categorical data and continuous data and binary data and some sort of kind of, text data. You had to map everything to some type of numerical in order to combine it. Foundation models are allowing people to develop methodology to combine text and video and numbers all together to do all sorts of different analyses. This is the technology that's kind of changed and transformed how we think about the work that we do. So what I'm going to cover today are 3 big buckets of where I see the field going in precision health. And a lot of this is work that I guess I'll focus most in the translational bioinformatics area. That's where I'm spending most of my time. But for this audience, I also wanted to touch on what's happening in computer vision and imageomics. That's another space that is really blown up. And actually, they're quite far ahead of the rest of us in translational bioinformatics. And then I do want to touch on what's happening in healthcare. I think that what we're seeing in kind of clinical care is a huge paradigm shift in how care is being practiced because of AI. And that is going to feed back into the research that we're doing, because as they're using these AI models to kind of change the way they deliver healthcare in the clinic, that's also creating more and different data for us to work with, for those of us who are working with electronic health records as part of our research program. And at the end, I do want to touch on kind of everything else that you can and should be thinking about when using AI, just in kind of your day-to-day work life or personal life. Okay, so first, the translational bioinformatics. So one space that I personally am not working in, but I would be remiss not to mention it, is in this new drug development process. So there are researchers kind of all across the world, and as well as some kind of computer science companies, like NVIDIA is really excited about this area, but specifically in partnerships with labs. And it's this concept of having the lab in the loop. They're creating new peptides, new messenger RNA targets, new antibodies, new antibiotics, you name it. And what's changed is that the ability to take data and feed it into AI models to basically predict drug target affinity, to predict the structure of a protein, to predict what might bind to what and at what strength, has completely expedited the process of narrowing down the number of targets to run experiments on. Previously, we would use the literature. You would do, X-ray crystallography. You would come up with a structure. You would then run some simulation models. You would pick a few. You would test them in the lab. You would feed back that data. Then you would do it again and again. What we're seeing now is that this process, instead of taking years, is taking months and sometimes even weeks. And it has expedited the process of that. What is typically in a drug development timeline, you'll often see like the just identifying the target takes, up to 10 or more years. And then from there, then it goes into clinical trials. That first part of the pipeline, now, as I said, it's months or up to a year instead of many years because of AI. We're also starting to see on the clinical trial side of things, kind of that next part. You still have to go through and do the clinical trials, first you test things in cell lines and then in a model system and then in humans. The human part, typically the most time-consuming part, and those of you who are doing clinical trials as part of your CTSI would know this, the recruitment of people, the identification of good candidates for the trial, and then the recruitment of those people is so time-consuming and expensive. Like a big part of the trial is just literally finding the people and calling them on the phone and getting them to come into a clinic. You know what chatbots are really good at? Calling people, texting people over and over and over, and they don't care if you don't pick up. They will keep trying. And so people are starting to leverage these chatbots as well as leveraging the AI to find the patients. So imagine being able to tell, a chat GPT type model, please identify patients who have this condition, or between this age and this age, are not on these other medications. You could imagine being able to do that. And so people are starting to develop that as well. So I think we're going to see huge changes in both the development of kind of figuring out what the drug targets are, but also in the clinical trial. What I'm thinking a lot about, and a lot of my students and postdocs in my lab are thinking about, is enriched EHR phenotyping. So I've been working in electronic health records since 2004, so it's been more than 20 years. For those who haven't done that yet, it's an incredibly rich resource. It is complicated. It is not straightforward and simple. When we first started working with those data, I remember clinicians, so at the time I was a new assistant professor at Vanderbilt, and a lot of the clinicians said, you cannot possibly use electronic health record data for research. The data in there are garbage. They're in there for billing insurance companies, for scheduling appointments, and for ordering tests. That's what it's for. You can't use that for research. And so myself and another small group of colleagues kind of took that on as a challenge, and we were like, all right, well, let's bet. Let's see if we can figure out how do we take that data and use it for research. And it turns out it's incredibly useful. Yes, you have to do a lot of cleaning of the data. You can't just like dump it out of the EHR, but between the diagnosis codes, medications, vital signs, procedure codes, lab measurements, all of the kind of additional imaging and types of things that you do, you can pull out a lot of data and identify who is a case of a particular disease, who's a control, and it's actually really powerful. Because of large language models, we are seeing the ability to mine the clinical notes and the reports from these other types of data totally transform. We are able to do so much more with the notes than we were previously able. But what I've been thinking a lot more about is how do we develop better definitions of a phenotype? So, you know, as David said at the beginning, or I'm sorry, Dan said at the beginning, my goal of my lab is genetic architecture, and I've been interested in this since I did my PhD. And one of the things that has bothered me the whole time is how we define phenotypes. So much of what we do in human genetics is we identify a group of people, these are our cases, and then another group of people, and these are our controls. The cases, if you think about almost any trait, not all of them, but many of the diseases and traits that we study, they are not homogeneous. There is not one phenotype in there. Often it's many, many phenotypes. Some people develop the disease younger, some older. Some progress really rapidly, others progress really slowly. In some, the first line therapy works, and in others, it takes to the third or fourth or fifth line therapy before it works. Why? Probably because it's not one phenotype. We know that complex traits are complex. It's like literally the first word of the name of the traits, and yet we treat them very simply. Why? Because many of us are statisticians and we want statistical power, and a big sample size gives us more power. But the other piece of that statistical power calculation is effect size. And so what happens when we combine 5, 7, 10 different effects all together? We're probably weakening the signal on our statistical power to detect any one of them. So I've been thinking a lot about subtyping, and this idea isn't new. I think in a lot of fields, people were trying to use what they see in patients to do subtyping. I know back when I was at Vanderbilt, I remember specifically in autism, they were trying to create subtypes of disease. So this group of kids has more kind of social dynamic differences, and this group of kids has more repetitive behavior, and this group of kids has more cognitive delay. And let's see if we define them based on these and we run our linkage analysis or we run our genetic association analysis, do we pick up differences? And the answer is no, we didn't pick up much different. Because of all of the rich data we have in the health record, as well as the methods that we have today, I want to not use what we think the differences subtypes might be, but could we use the data and in a data-driven way define subtypes of disease? And so I'm going to tell you one story of where we've been trying this, although we're certainly talking about it in other phenotypes. So this is a study of heart failure that I did with a cardiologist, Dr. Nosheen Reza. And she really wanted to look at this subtyping. So as a clinician, she said that heart failure looks very different. Some people get very sick and progress very rapidly, and their mortality is cut short in a big way. There are other people who have heart failure for decades and never progress that far. It's just kind of, they're on medication and it's well controlled for a really long time. Some people end up with severe comorbidities, other people don't. And so she said, I really think there are disease subtypes here. And maybe if we could identify them, we could then do the genetic study in the subtypes. Maybe we could do different treatment analyses in the subtypes if we could just define them. So she set out to do some unsupervised machine learning. So unsupervised machine learning is where you don't tell the algorithm what the labels of the people are. You allow the algorithm to figure out and put labels on. And then you can look at those labels and see if they make sense. And so in this particular data set, it was about 5,000 people with heart failure. So cases only, people who had been diagnosed with heart failure, had been on medications for heart failure. And then we took about 4,000 other variables from their electronic health record. This include all diagnosis codes that they've had, procedure codes, a group of maybe 50 lab measurements, vital signs, et cetera. And we fed them into a UMAP and just said, identify if there are clusters. So she was very excited. And initially she came, she said, I found 2 clusters. It looks like there's 2 clusters. And she was like, what do I do next? Because she was, I should mention that she was she's an MD, but she was doing a master's in translational research and specifically focusing on data science and informatics and learning how to do this. So I said, well, my first suspicion is that this is HFpEF and HFrEF, which are the 2 most common known subtypes of heart failure. I said, why don't you put the kind of now label the data? So color the dots. Each dot is a person. Color them based on HFpEF and HFrEF, which is 2 different types of ejection fraction labels of heart failure. So she did that and they were all intermixed. She said, it's not that. I'm like, okay. We tried a couple of other features. None of them worked. And I was like, Nosheen, did you include sex as a covariate? Is sex a field in the data set? And she said, oh no, I figured that would be like a clear discriminator. So I didn't include sex. Good call. But did you include both sexes in the analysis? Is this males and females? And she was like, oh, well, yeah, because while the male version of heart failure in females sometimes looks different, it's not clearly sex specific. I said, okay, could you do me a favor and label this plot with sex? And sure enough, that's what the UMAP clustered, males and females. Why? Because men and women, males and females, are different in their electronic health record. There are organs in our bodies that we don't share, and therefore there are phenotypes that you will have that will never show up in the other sex. That is what it's picking up on. You know, there's lots of pregnancy-related traits and phenotypes and labels in females that don't show up in a male record ever. And so that is what the UMAP found, nothing to do with heart failure. It's just males and females. So for anyone embarking on any unsupervised machine learning with electronic health records, you have to stratify by sex. You also should think about age as well. Now, in this particular analysis, everyone is adult and kind of within a tight enough age range that didn't matter. But in health systems where you have both pediatric and adult data, imagine putting the data into an algorithm. You know, think about LDL levels. They're very different in children versus adults. Think about lots of diagnoses. Dementia, osteoarthritis, menopause, all sorts of things that would never show up in a pediatric chart. Those are basically you will cluster age as the first thing. It'll be sex, age. So once we did sex stratification, redid the analysis, she did a kind of a post hoc analysis to figure out the number of clusters that was optimal, kind of minimizing the within cluster error or differences and maximizing the between cluster differences. And what she found in both males and females, 4 clusters was optimal. They're slightly different. So we kind of then went back and did an analysis of what are the features that really drive those. In some, it's a more young cohort with more severe hypertension and kidney dysfunction as part of their heart failure. And others, it's an older group, smokers. And so there are some clinical subtypes kind of that we identified post hoc. Now she's going back, I think, and we're going to do kind of treatment analysis and probably a genetic analysis to see, are there genetics that would explain these differences? This paper is currently in revision with one of the cardiac journals. So the other area that I'm thinking a lot about, and this is work I'm doing with some of my graduate students, is could we build longitudinal models of disease or progression instead of just cases and controls? And so if you think about the electronic health record, so one of the beautiful things about it is it collects tons of data, but generally we just look at it in snapshots. So instead, imagine for each patient in a health system, you have all of their medications, their procedures, their labs, their diagnoses, all over time. What we're trying now is, could we pull all that data together and actually create those longitudinal models use kind of a cross-validation type approach where we train with our data but leave data out for testing and run something like an LSTM, which is a long short-term memory model. It's a type of neural network type method. And then ask questions like, if you were to say, take everyone who's diagnosed, but then go back 3 months or 6 months or 10 months, could you have predicted their diagnosis? Could you predict who would develop it in so many months? Could you develop who wouldn't? Who progresses? So if you went from disease, do they progress in 3 or 5 or different ways? So we're starting to kind of try out different modeling approaches. And then similarly, what I would love to get us to the point of doing is putting a chatbot around that. So the electronic health record is basically a database. And for those of you who know databases, it's like Epic is something like, I don't know, 2,000 SQL tables. And it's just static SQL tables. And so querying it with a chatbot is tricky. What you'd love to be able to do is to create these patient maps, like here is what happened at each time point in a patient's life, and then ask questions like, how many times has this patient reported neuropathy in the limbs over the last decade? And be able to say, they've had numbness or tingling in their hands and feet, you know, on this date, this date, this date, and this date. Okay, when were they prescribed this medication? Was it before or after those instances? Oh, before. Okay, are they having peripheral neuropathy that is a side effect of a medication? Maybe they're a good candidate for a pharmacogenetic analysis. What we want is to be able to interact with the data in a real language kind of way, rather than these join this, else that, if this, then join that. It's very complicated. So I hope that we can get to this point. I'm aware that Epic is working on more of the longitudinal type modeling currently. It's something that came up at UGM last year. And so I'm hoping that they'll have a better data structure for us to work with in the future, other than thousands of SQL tables. One thing I want to mention before I leave this topic is just, and this is a great reference if you're interested in this area, there's a lot of potential bias in healthcare data that you just have to be really mindful of when you're using AI, or really any statistical method, anything you're doing with EHR data. It's, you know, who has access to care, what type of care they get, are there labeling biases based on kind of provider perceptions? I know at Penn, we are very hesitant to use self-report ethnicity or race from the EHR, and I do self-report in air quotes because it's not always self-report. In some clinics, it is. They will say, and how do you identify? Or they will send them an Epic, you know, my chart kind of survey to fill out. And in other clinics, a human looks at someone and says, you look X, and they pick the label. And so that is not a good label to use. And so we, especially with our biobank, we try to use genetically inferred ancestry or genetic similarity with labeled reference populations so that we can get a better sense. But just being aware there's a lot of bias in the data. As we have a lot of rich data that I mentioned, what we're missing is like everything else that happens in a person's life. So being able to leverage either surveys or wearables or mobile phones, or we're also starting to do, we've geocoded everyone in our health record, and we're now linking those data with different public repositories. So data from the EPA on air pollution and water pollution, data from the CDC on different infectious agents, data from the US Geologic Survey and looking at access to green space and other social determinants of health. So I think incorporating all of those data will also be incredibly important. So I think what we're going to see in the field is a lot more longitudinal and trajectory modeling. I think the days of identifying cases and controls are probably behind us. That it's just, there's so much more we could do, especially now that we have the EHR data. I also think incorporating this exposome and kind of the real life world environment of patients in our health systems will also be incredibly important as we think about their diagnoses, but also their progression in disease. A lot of this, you know, the diagnosis is a piece of it, but lifestyle factors and environmental exposures clearly play a role. And so incorporating that in the modeling will be important. And I think what I'd love for us to get to is identifying people at risk for disease before they're diagnosed, so that perhaps we could do prevention so that we don't all have to get disease. You know, as a person in their kind of second half of 40s or nearing on 50, like I don't want to develop disease. I would like to know that I'm at risk and either take a medication early, take a supplement, whatever. I don't want to get it. So I hope that we can shift in medicine and start to figure out what were the lab measurement changes. You know, were there sodium and potassium levels predictive of some cardiac event? 3 years prior if we had just known and done something different. Okay, I'm going to switch now to imageomics and be brief about this. This, as I said, is not a space that I work in, but being aware and thinking about collaborating with people working in computer vision, if you're interested in image analysis, is a great path. Radiology is light years ahead of the rest of us. They have been using AI for quite some time. I know of an example at Penn that I just recently learned about, that in the emergency room, people who are suspected of having a stroke go in for an MRI, and the MRI machine has AI that runs, it runs the image and then it does an image analysis. And then the machine will text the emergency room physician if it looks like that patient is having a stroke so that they can give them a medication in the emergency room. In the past, they would send the scan to a radiologist, the radiologist would look at it, and then the radiologist would call the emergency room. They have completely taken the radiologist out of the loop, which I was terrified and kind of shocked to hear, but they said the implementation of the medicine, there's a tight window of time, and Dan could probably teach this better than I can, small window of time that you can give that medication, and the risk of missing that was higher than the risk of it being wrong. And so now they've implemented that. So radiology is far ahead. Digital pathology is rapidly advancing. And this is an example from one of my colleagues, Dr. Mingyao Li. She is a biostatistician, and this is an example from one of her papers using a test data set of digital pathology and spatial transcriptomics for breast cancer. And what you note is these kind of warmer colors are annotations of where the cancer cells are. And then kind of these cooler colors, the blues and greens, are areas that are not cancer. She developed an AI method called iStar that is automatically detecting where the surgical margins should be. And what you'll note is that it identified regions way out here. So most of the cancer cells, and certainly what the pathologist labeled, were over here. There were cancer cells over here that her method picked up that the pathologist and the previous methods missed. And so imagine if you're trying to decide between a lumpectomy or a full mastectomy for a woman with breast cancer. Like, if you don't realize there are cancer cells that are far distant, you might just do a lumpectomy. But as a woman, I would rather take the whole thing. If there's, if there are cells far away, like these are the cells that might cause recurrence. And so I think what we're going to see in this kind of marriage between digital pathology and spatial transcriptomics is going to be transformational for medicine. And I think it's a really great area to think about. I'm going to go back one slide just to mention, there's one other study, especially for those of you who do genomic analysis, this paper that came out in Nature last year. They did a genome analysis, whole genome sequencing analysis with imaging data, and I found it fascinating. They took the sequence data, the actual like ACTG data, they converted it into grayscale image, and then they used a video game engine to analyze the image to try to find patterns that were predictive of disease. It never would have occurred to me to take our sequence data and turn it into an image. Like, most genotyping data is an image and we turn it into numbers. They actually turned the numbers back into an image for analysis. Fascinating. I don't know if it'll actually work long term, but I think it's a really cool area. And so, especially for the students who are interested, I would look into it and think about different ways that you might use that technology. Couple of warnings about computer vision. AI is actually not so smart. I know intelligence is in the name. A lot of these tools are pattern matching. They are looking at previous patterns and previous labels and predicting future labels. So the one image on the left, this is an article. It's actually, I've seen this image in many other people's talks, not just mine. Anyone know what's wrong with the image? That it says breast cancer. This is not a breast. This is a head. Here are eyes. These are brain. This is a brain. These are brain images. If Google used brain images to predict breast cancer, like, that's cool. That is not what they did. I hope that this is a marketing mistake and not actually an analysis mistake, but it's not so far off from what could happen. So the other example is in dermatology. There is a pretty infamous example of this in melanoma. Back in around 2018, 2019, a group identified a really good AI method that could identify melanoma better than dermatologists. And so I think a patent got filed. There are startups being spun out. Now there are apps on your phone that you could just like take a picture of a freckle and it will like give you the probability of melanoma. And what they realized, especially once it was on a mobile app, that like you could just walk around and like take a picture of a water bottle. If I put a ruler next to the water bottle, it would say melanoma, because what the AI identified was the presence of a ruler, because dermatologists measure the size of a melanoma. They do not measure the size of a freckle. And so what the AI learned was ruler. And so I share this to say, if you're going to start to do imaging analysis, whether it's the spatial omics data, whether it's pathology, radiology, cell biology, think about what other artifacts might be in the field of vision that you're looking at, because the AI won't know that that oncologist name in the corner is an oncologist. It doesn't know that. But if all of your cancer samples have an oncologist's name and it's the same one, and then all of your healthy control slides have a different doctor's name, it will learn that doctor name compared to that doctor name if it's in the image. And so you really need to think about, what am I showing the AI? Because it doesn't know the difference between words and names or rulers and cancer cells. It knows it's picking up images. All right, the last section is just talking about healthcare. It's changing in a big way. So last year, or actually 2 years ago, all of the headlines were about how ChatGPT and AI and chatbots were really bad at medicine. Don't text Google, or don't go to Google, don't go to ChatGPT and ask for medical advice. And then this year, there were articles that said, actually, ChatGPT beats doctors at diagnosing. And so now everybody's like, oh, so chatbots are better than doctors. Do we even need doctors anymore? This study was done by Jonathan Chen up at Stanford, and I talked with him about this earlier this year. He was very disappointed with the way that the New York Times and other media picked up the paper, because the study design was this. If you take a group of physicians and you take ChatGPT or other large language model, and then you take a group of physicians using ChatGPT and compare how they do at diagnosing, what he found was that the chatbot did best, and then the physician did second best, and then the physician using a chatbot did the worst. The point of his study was to evaluate what happens if you take a medical doctor who has never used a chatbot and then tell them, use this in your workflow to make the diagnoses. They did the worst, because they didn't know how it worked, they didn't trust it, they weren't sure how to do the prompts, like how do you engineer the right prompt to do the diagnosis? They had no idea. So his point is that we need to teach physicians how to do the prompts, to use a chatbot to help and be a tool in their diagnosis. The point was not that the chatbot is better than a doctor. A doctor using a chatbot will be better than a doctor without a chatbot if the chatbot has knowledge about things that doctor has never seen or never been taught before. And so I think his work was really, really exciting and interesting. It was picked up, though, in the wrong way. So again, it's on us as people writing this up to be really clear with our design, really clear with our finding. That doesn't mean that the media won't pick it up and make mistakes. So one of the studies I'm most excited about at Penn is called Reduce. It's really motivated by this idea that doctors become doctors to interact with patients and save patient lives. And what's happening, and this is an article from 2011, a child drew this. This is the child. And when she goes to the doctor, this is her family sitting waiting. And this is the doctor with his back to her. He's sitting at the computer. No doctor becomes a doctor because they want to sit at a computer and type in lots of information about their patient. They became a doctor to interact with the patient. And so the idea of Reduce is, could we take out the computer and that computer piece of a patient interaction? And instead of spending the whole visit documenting, could we instead use AI to capture information about the visit? And so what they are doing is using audio and video to capture the full patient-provider interaction and then analyzing that for different elements. And so I'm going to try to show a video. See if I can get it to work.
As a pediatrician, as a physician, the biggest challenge that we face right now has to do with burnout.
I mean, clinician burnout is an ongoing challenge, and I think certainly documentation is part of that. A lot of our job is documentation of one way or another.
There have been a lot of technologies that have been used in healthcare, but almost never in the exam room, because it's so hard to get access to the data that you would use to train. So the project we called Reduce, which essentially stands for Reimagining Documentation Using Computational Enhancement. The goal of that project is to think not just though about documentation, but to get beyond it and to think about ways in which the entire visit can be quantified, documented, and reused in support of patient care and quality.
I am a participant in Dr. Johnson's trial. I'm sort of outfitted with some technology. So a camera that goes over my head that records my interaction with the patient. And then there's a camera that records the whole room and the screen. And then we go through all of their regular medical problems, et cetera, from start to finish.
And one of the most exciting parts of the project that the Pioneer Award was able to allow us to do was to spend the first year in sort of a goal-free state, really investigating what happens in primary care. So we've been recording visits and we've been watching simulated patient encounters now for about a year. We have a group called the Book Club, and the name seems odd until you think about the goal of a book club. In our case, we're using the videos that we are recording as a part of the Reduce project to instantiate conversations in the book club.
One of the things that amazed me is they spent literally about 6 minutes doing paperwork and next appointment and referrals. 6 minutes. I mean, you didn't go to medical school to figure out a calendar.
And we noticed when we were watching these videos that it is absolutely the case that doctors aren't doctoring anymore. And everything that we're thinking about right now has to do with how do we automate something? How do we provide something without asking anything else of either the patient or the clinician other than just have the visit you need to have today?
You know, I think fundamentally why most of us go into medicine and what drives physicians is the patient-doctor relationship. Anything that will help facilitate that relationship is valuable. And I think there is a lot of potential to leverage all of this data that we now have to make it even more efficient.
So my hope is that this project begins a movement of people thinking a lot more about how we should be reimagining the patient-healthcare provider interaction using the data that they've seen from these videos and other videos from other sites around the country, and using some of that to also create and innovate in spaces we've never thought about.
Okay, so I love the idea of this. It's capturing all of this quantitative information that then you can imagine applying AI to. So looking at things like gait. So if you work in a movement disorder clinic, for example, you know, one of the things you look at is how someone's gait changes over time. Well, if they come into the clinic every 6 months, like, would you as the human remember how much shuffle was in their step, you know, from this visit to the next visit? If the AI could actually quantify that and then have that in the chart before you go into the room, or even before you go into the room, it has already measured the patient walking into the room, did the calculation, and before you go in, you get information like their gait has changed by this amount. It could look at sentiment, you know, how anxious or depressed are they? You know, when people are feeling really good, they're going to sit upright and have a certain kind of, you know, projection. When people are depressed, they're more withdrawn. And if they're anxious, they're like tapping and moving, right? So these are things that the human eye could see, but it would be hard to quantify. AI could quantify that. One of the other things I love about this, especially for those of you who are into data science and computer science, is you saw the stick figures in the videos. So they are de-identifying the videos, and the plan is to make all of those videos publicly available so that the entire community can do data mining of those images to better understand the movements and interactions and make predictions. The hope is that it will also kind of remove some of the, maybe some of the biases, because you can't tell from the stick figure the gender of the person, the sex of the person, the, you know, what race or ethnicity they came from. Really, all of that is blurred. And so really you just see the movements of the people. So I think that what we're going to see is a transformation in how visits are done. There's already a lot of data on ambient listening. A lot of health systems are already using that and starting to publish on how you can, you know, use the ambient listening. So just listen to the room and then turn it into notes or turn it into structured data. But I think we're going to see more and more with video. I think it may improve the diagnostic accuracy of what's happening, which then go back to the beginning. If we want to do deeper EHR phenotyping, wouldn't it be great to have all this quantitative information about what is actually happening in the visit? So I think the types of data we'll be able to get out of the EHR is also going to change. All right, in this very last little bit, I just want to share everything else you can, and my opinion, should be using AI for. So A quick show of hands in the room. How many people are using LLMs in your day-to-day workflow? Okay, not everyone. The rest of you, I hope I encourage you to do it. You should definitely do it. The amount of things that you can capture and use this tool for is beyond fascinating. Actually, Eleazar was showing me stuff this morning that I didn't even know we could do. So yeah, you could go bug him later. Things like summarizing papers or documents. So earlier this year, I had an MRI. I got this really lengthy report with lots of medical jargon. I'm like, what the heck does this say? And so I just copied it into ChatGPT and I'm like, can you tell me in human English, what does this MRI say? And so it wrote up a report. And then I'm like, okay, but is it right? Because AI is sometimes wrong. And so I started to Google the phrases and like actually look them up, and they were correct. Super helpful. You could do the same thing with a really complicated paper that you don't understand. Taking ideas and turning them into prose. I know lots of people that have taken their bulleted list of ideas and said, can you turn this into a specific Ames page for an NIH grant? It needs to be 1 page. And it will do it. Sometimes brilliant, sometimes total garbage. But you could try it. Sometimes it works really well. Doing letters of recommendation. So I recently, I guess late last year, was getting nominated for an award. And I had to get 5 letters. And so I asked, 5 colleagues, could you write a letter for me? Like, absolutely, send me a draft. Like, oh, I have to write 5 drafts of the same letter about myself. So I went to ChatGPT and I said, here's an example of a style of letter that I need. It's a letter I wrote for someone else. And here's my CV. Could you draft a letter of support for this award? Here's the description of the award. And so it wrote a letter. I'm like, okay, that looks pretty good. Could you rewrite this letter in the voice of a 48-year-old male surgeon? And it rewrote the letter much shorter and more direct. And then I said, now could you rewrite this letter like a 55-year-old medical geneticist female? And so it wrote a longer letter, and when it was more descriptive. And you laugh, and I kind of laugh too, like, oh my God, the stereotypes are really deep. It's very biased and stereotyped for sure. But it wrote the letter. I used kind of like gave descriptions of the 5 people I had asked, and it did it. Now, this was last year. I bet today, if I said, could you write the letter in a voice of Marylyn Ritchie, it would do it and it would sound like me, because now it is starting to learn who we are. Another quick example, though, I asked it to write a description of what have I done in my career? What was my impact in science? It was something I had to do for a graduate student who was applying for a fellowship, and I didn't have time. And so I was like, ChatGPT, what has Marylyn Ritchie done in her career? I need this in a 1,000-word essay. It wrote a beautiful essay up until the last paragraph, where I had not done that at all. It said that I had published, field leading software in natural language processing, and I had released multiple packages to the scientific community. I have 0 natural language processing packages, but I have written about it in review papers. And so I think what it did was found that I had described it in a paper that I am the author of, but it's a review paper. Again, not smart, not intelligent. It's pattern matching. So it found my name and a field, but the rest of it was correct. And it was stuff that I had done. And so it can really simplify and make faster the things that you do, but you have to check the work. Checking grammar and writing, especially for people where English is a second language, it is really good at that. Writing computer code and checking code, phenomenal. And also making lecture and slide decks. So that's new. I just started playing around with it. It did not make this slide deck. It did give me ideas for the title that I only slightly tweaked. I said, I'm giving a talk at UCLA, and here's the general theme of the talk. What are some titles? And it gave me 10, and they were all like movie star Hollywood-ish. It was actually kind of fun. But now it will make slide decks and even make figures for the slide deck. But you have to be really careful. It is not always right, as I told you. It is particularly bad with numbers. I read in Peter Lee and Zach Kohane's book on AI, it cannot solve a Sudoku puzzle, but it can write computer code to solve a Sudoku puzzle. Why? Because there's probably code on the internet that it found the pattern and mapped it, but it can't do it because it is not smart. It can't do backward logic, right? Think about, everybody's probably done Sudoku. You put in numbers and you try it, and then you're like, oh, that's not right. You erase and go back. It can't go forward and back. And also with biological things, really bad. Our gene names are terrible. ABCA1, ApoCL2, ApoE3. It can't do the letters and numbers. They look similar enough that it thinks it's right. So if you go to ChatGPT and say, tell me what RS12345, what gene is it in? It's wrong most of the time. It does not know those. You also need to be really careful whether they're allowed or not. Some journals allow it, some don't. I would be careful about that. And one last reference for you, if you're interested in learning more, I've mentioned kind of bias and trustworthiness and how right and wrong, really good kind of paper that sets up the framework for how you think about it. So in closing, I want to share some cartoon images from a cartoon that I watched as a child. So this is the Jetsons. If you're not familiar, this is a cartoon that was out in the 1960s. And these technologies were things that I remember as a kid kind of laughing that they even thought about this in the cartoon. So one is a robot that vacuums so that humans don't have to. Anyone have a Roomba? I have one on every floor of my house. A watch where you could listen to things or watch things. I can start my car from my watch now. Being able to see someone on a screen when you talk to them on the telephone. When I was a kid, telephones were attached to a wall with a cord. Like the idea that you could see someone's face when you tell them something on the phone was laughable. My teenagers can't imagine a world where you don't see the person when you talk to them. They're like, Mom, you just hit FaceTime? Like, yeah, guys, we didn't have cell phones. And then the last one was reading the paper on a screen. So in my childhood, the only way to read the news was on the black and white pieces of paper that made your hands all dirty. This was all technology that was a dream and I grew up in the 80s. This was a dream in the 80s. We have all of this today. And so I say this for if you're thinking like, could we use AI for that? Probably. I would encourage you to try it. Find partners or collaborators to help you try it because the technologies today that we can only dream we might be able to do, we probably can do. And with the pace of AI, we can probably do it much faster than from the 80s to today. And so with that, I'll just say, I think we're at the very tip of the iceberg and there's so much more that we could be doing. It's really exciting time to be in science. And I just want to acknowledge the various projects I talked about belong to lots of people. This is my lab group and then lots of other teams at Penn. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much. We have time for questions. I don't have my computer open, so if there are questions, I'll check out in the what?
Yeah.
Okay, so any questions? Like, I guess I can start it off. Geotagging, folks, is super interesting and a super powerful way to do the things you were mentioning. How do you do that within the kind of privacy issues? And we've been kind of struggling here with the kind of de-identified data mart that we have and then kind of more identifiable. Have you found ways to geotag people in a de-identified way, or is it, how is that working?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So what we've done is we have so the way that our kind of infrastructure is set up, we have people who are honest brokers who are basically kind of clinical data analysts who have done all of the appropriate training that they are allowed to have access to the identified version of all of the data. They are not researchers per se, they are kind of researcher assistants. So they'll do the de-identification, do the kind of linkages. So what we've done is set up an environment where these individuals can take the geolocation of where people live, do the linkage with these public databases and pull back just the variables. So pull back their access to green space, the social vulnerability index for the neighborhood that they live in, pull back the level of ozone or PM 2.5 that they have exposure to, or the level of lead in the water in the area that they're in. And then what we make available to the researchers are only the variables that map. So we won't let the researchers have their geolocation because that is more of an identifier than their name. And so that's the way that we've dealt with it. It's working so far. Every once in a while, we have a researcher who wants to use a new methodology. And so in some cases, we've created kind of a carve out space of our Azure workspace where we will let them have access to it, but only for that study. And then once they do their mapping, then they have to go back to the honest broker, do the de-identification before kind of the students in the lab can have access.
Yeah, super interesting. Yeah, it's really a great idea.
I mean, I will say the one caveat, and certainly the people that work in epidemiology have talked with them about this. There's I guess two kind of limitations. One is that we map, most of the time it's their current address, and people move a lot,
Sure.
especially in cities that are living in apartments, they move often. So generally we're mapping their current address. The second is that it's neighborhood level data. And so we probably all know that in any various neighborhood, kind of what happens in your household is different from what's happening in the household right next door or 3 doors down. And so there certainly could be some individual level variability that is missed by taking neighborhood level data. Certain things wouldn't be, like your ozone exposure is the same, most likely your house and 3 houses down. And quite frankly, you couldn't ask a person about your ozone exposure. Like, how much ozone are you exposed to? Like, nobody knows that, but the EPA does. So you just have to take it with a caveat that some of the variables, social vulnerability index is a big one. So that's using things like the average number of people in the household, number of cars in the household, kind of square footage of the household, and then it's kind of a social determinant of health. That could be very different house to house to house within a neighborhood. So it does kind of an average based on census data, which is an average. It's better than having nothing, I think, but that is a limitation.
Sure. Sure, yeah.
Thank you. Great talk. Thank you so much for that. I really like the beginning, kind of going through the history of everything. That was a really nice segue and actually getting into the weeds of it. But,
Thank you.
you know, having been in this for so long and me just kind of getting into this field and probably growing up around a similar time as your kids with, you know, the FaceTime and everything like that. What changed that kind of led to this rapid acceleration of this technology over the past, you know, 5-6 years? I mean, it seems like from the 50s to the, let's just say 90s, it doesn't seem like there was much made. And then all of a sudden, it just seems man, I mean, since 2020, that it's just like a rocket ship.
Yeah.
So what was it in the field? What was it in the technologies that actually accelerated it to like where we see today?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think a couple of things. One is GPU computing and access to GPU computing. So for most of these models, you need this large scale GPU computing in order to run them. And we just didn't have them in the past. Our GPUs have been around for a while, but they were so expensive that only like the very most expensive, you know, or richest labs had them. Now they're kind of accessible. They're a commodity that most groups could have. So I think that's part of it. I think the technology around foundation models and large language models really transformed kind of between 2018 and 2022. Just that field moved a lot, again, because they had the resources. I think from the 90s or 2000 to today, the other thing that has changed a lot is kind of the global collaborations. So, you know, air travel used to be much more expensive. The internet was more expensive and wasn't as fast as it is now. And so now our ability to work and collaborate in real time with people all over the world is just so much easier. I mean, when I was even early faculty, I still remember sending manuscripts in manila envelopes to collaborators because the files were sometimes too big to email. And we didn't have Dropbox, so there wasn't another way to share it. So you would print it, you would put it in a big envelope and FedEx it like to them for them to edit the manuscript. They would write on it in red pen and then mail it back to you. Never before that. So like even that I think has changed our ability to collaborate, you know, worldwide. And so it might be that, you know, people in like South Korea is very advanced in AI. And so the ability for people in the US to partner with them has just changed globally in the last, you know, 20, 30 years in ways that I don't know that we could have done back in the 90s and early 2000s.
Combination of hardware and collaboration.
Yeah. Yeah. For those on Zoom, he said a combination of hardware and collaboration globally.
I think we can take one more short question. We've just run a little over. But I want to thank you for a really inspiring talk. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all so much.
Thanks.